He took the helm of the Assembly of First Nations in December 2014. In the nearly 6 months since then, he's been active in engaging the federal government on several key issues, including new processes for self-determination and treaty rights, and calling for a national inquiry into missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls. Joining us now for more on what he hopes to accomplish in the nation's capital, Perry Bellegarde, National Chief of the Assembly of First Nations. And Chief Bellegarde, it's good to have you on TVO tonight. How are you doing?
I'm great. Good. Thanks for the opportunity to be here.
Appreciate you joining us. As we pointed out, you did win the leadership just in December, and it was, I think it's worth saying, on the first ballot. When you first challenged for the leadership back in 2009, if memory serves, it took 8 ballots to decide the affair between you and Sean Atleo, including 6 ballots in which I think you were practically tied. What does this say, in your view, given the result more recently, about the organization that you're heading compared to the one that Sean Atleo inherited?
Well, again, for me, I'm very humbled and honored by the first ballot majority win, 63% of the vote on the first ballot. And to me, that indicates a strong mandate. And the Chiefs are really united in the Assembly of First Nations. And we want to work together in a strong national collective voice. And it's all about bringing about change. And when you're united, when you're strong, and you have that national vision, you can get things done. And so we're going to move forward, and I'm really humbled and honored by that first ballot victory.
You know, of course, that your predecessor was heavily criticized because of the agreement that he came to in the federal government's proposed overhaul of Aboriginal education. What is happening with that overhaul at this point?
Well, we just reached out to Minister Valcourt again. You know, it's Bill C-33, and the government announced $1.9 billion for education. Which I always say is a start, but we have to really close. There's a huge gap, you know, and I keep talking about on-reserve tuition being at $6,500 per child. In the provincial school systems, it's close to $11,000, and in the French school systems, it's almost $20,000. And so there's a huge fiscal gap that needs to be addressed. And we have to reach out to the federal crown because they have obligations. And when we start talking about a relationship with this government, Bill C-33 kind of went off the rails. You know, our chiefs in the Assembly in December gave a mandate for a national fiscal framework as it relates to education, still calling on the government to re-engage again. And I've asked the minister, I know you're going out to the regions now and looking at regional processes, regional dialogues. I've asked him to look at re-engaging with the AFN and look at re-engaging with our National Chiefs Committee on Education and our National Indian Education Council to jointly develop and jointly work on policy and legislation. We can't arrive at a same place, but we need to collectively do it together. And that's the ask I've made, and I'm going to continue to keep reaching out to the Crown to develop joint processes going forward. National frameworks can be developed, but is flexible enough as well to look at the regional approaches as well.
Former Prime Minister Paul Martin has, of course, crisscrossed the country many times making the same point that you have. Why do you think this gap between what Aboriginal students are funded and other Canadians are funded is so wide still?
It's been so wide because I think a lot of people don't get it in Canada, and the governments don't get it, that First Nations have faced a 2% funding cap for almost 20 years. And so that 2% funding cap, number one, doesn't keep up with inflation that goes up every year, doesn't keep up with the rising populations in First Nations communities. We have the fastest growing demographic, you know, is young First Nations men and women. And it also is not based on needs. The funding relationship with the Crown is not based on needs. So there has to be a new fiscal agreement with the Crown. And that's where we need to start looking at. So because a 2% cap has been there for the last 20 years, if you don't make immediate investments in education and training, the gap just continues to grow and grow and grow. And so that's why in this federal budget, I said it's a status quo budget. There are no direct investments in education and training and our housing, our access to potable water. So I called it a status quo budget. And that's not good for anybody. Because in Canada, when I talk about the gap, Canada, according to the United Nations Human Development Index, is rated 6th in terms of quality of life, very high up. But when you apply those same indices to Indigenous peoples, we're 63rd. And that's the gap that needs to be closed. And I always tell governments and people across Canada, can you imagine what this country will look like if we start moving from 63 up to 50, up to 40, up to 30, and almost get to the same level? this country will be fantastic because you're investing in human capital, young First Nations men and women, and getting them the education and the training and the skills they need to compete in not only this global the national economy, but the global economy. And that's where we need to start putting our heads.
Chief Bellegarde, I want to play a clip right now from your speech when you won the leadership back in December. Let's play this and then we'll come back and chat. Roll it, please.
Okay.
For far too long, we have been dispossessed of our homelands and the wealth of our rightful inheritance. Canada will no longer develop pipelines, no longer develop transmission lines or any infrastructure on our lands as business as usual. That is not on. First Nations peoples will oppose any development which deprives our children of the legacy of our ancestors. We will no longer accept poverty and hopelessness while resource companies and governments grow fat off our lands and territories and resources.
Strong, tough speech. Did you mean it to be a threatening speech to the Government of Canada?
I meant it to be a wake-up call. I meant it to be a wake-up call to the federal government and provincial governments and industry that before you try to build anything, before you try to build a pipeline, before you try to build a new mine or a processing plant on anything, build a relationship with First Nations people. Build that relationship in a productive, cooperative, collaborative way. Our people aren't opposed to development, but we want to be part of the economy and have access to jobs and wealth creation. But by having us involved in a meaningful relationship and development of any natural resource, like we bring the added element of respecting the land and the water, respecting the environment. So it's a double-edged sword that's good because we're going to be involved in the economy. We're going to be involved with creating jobs and wealth for our people, but we're also going to ensure that the strategies that are developed, the economic development strategies, they're long-term, sustainable economic development strategies that respect the land and water and the territories. And that's why I said the speech that way. I also had in the back of my mind the recent Supreme Court of Canada decision in the William case. The Chilcotin Nation, we hold them up because the Supreme Court of Canada has recognized Aboriginal rights and title. And basically means that we have to be involved now. And we want to create economic certainty. We want to create economic surety, in every provincial government. So we're asking governments to work with us, industry to work with us, so that we can jointly develop that sustainable economic development strategy. And I've even asked the provinces to think of a policy change, that before the provincial governments and territories issue any license or permit to any industry or company that's trying to develop the resource base, that they come into the provincial government and show that they have a strategy and plan within their company for First Nations engagement, that they have a representative workforce strategy, that they've got a First Nations procurement strategy, that they've got a relationship, and even a revenue generating stream in place, So that strategy should be in place for every corporation. And before they get a license or a permit from that provincial government to go and develop that resource, they have to have that plan in place. And so that's something, again, that we've got to do together. And so that speech that I made was a wake-up call. And a wake-up call to this country, because there's $675 billion of resource projects over the next 10 years that can potentially be developed. But we say only if you involve First Nations people in a meaningful, substantive way. And by doing that, we're sharing the land and resource wealth, which is what our relationship with the Crown and relationship with our non-Indigenous brothers and sisters was all about, to mutually benefit from sharing the land and resource wealth. Not 6 versus 63rd in terms of quality of life and the poverty we see and face. That's not what it's all about. And so that's why that speech was a wake-up call. And it's starting to get some traction, and I think it's the way we go forward in true reconciliation is by working together. And that's what the intent of that speech was.
That is clearly a huge issue, and I want to raise another huge issue with you right now. And in doing so, quote from a press release that you put out back in April. The press release says, serious concern that the federal government and the RCMP are withholding important and sensitive information about violence against Indigenous women and girls. RCMP Commissioner Bob Paulson yesterday confirmed comments made last week by Aboriginal Affairs and Northern Development Canada Minister Bernard Valcourt that 70% of Aboriginal women murdered in Canada were victims of violent acts by Aboriginal people. That 70% number has gained a lot of attention. Do you not think it's accurate?
Well, what I say to that is basically, let's verify the information and verify the information and break it down. You know, the 70% Aboriginal figure, is it First Nations men? Is it Métis men? Is it Inuit men? Is it on reserve? Is it off reserve? Is it status Indians? Is it non-status Indians? You got to break it down and verify the information. And once that's verified, then get it out.
But
get
do you
the
object to
information
that
out to the chiefs and councils.
Sorry, Chief, do you object to that number being used?
I'm not objecting to the number being used, you know, but let's verify it. That's why I'm saying. So that's why I question the points in it. Break it down. Because when you just use the number of 70% Aboriginal, well, break it down. Break it down. Like I say, is it 70% Indian men, 70% Métis men or Inuit, on reserve, off reserve? You got to break it down further, because once it's verified, then I say get the information out, and it's more important. What do we do with the information? How do we utilize it as RCMP and governments, federal, provincial, and First Nations governments, to utilize that information to end violence in our communities?
No, I
because
appreciate
that's what the issue is.
I appreciate the response, but of course, one of the reasons I suppose this is important is because there is an impression, perhaps in Canada, that the majority of this violence, tragic violence being perpetrated on Indigenous women and girls, is being done by quote-unquote white people. If that's not accurate, that's important to know, isn't it?
Well, you got to basically, again, break it down. And when I say if indeed it is proven, then we know then the system of intergenerational effects of residential schools is the root cause. So what are we doing to deal with that issue in terms of the men's wellness centers? Because to educate Canadians, think about it, when your children are subjugated, when 5 or 6 years old, taken to a residential school, then everything good about being Indian is taught you that it's no good. Your languages are no good, your ceremonies are no good, your families, you're cut off from your family and your communities and your nations. And then on top of that, you're subject to physical abuse, to sexual abuse, to mental abuse. You're not healthy coming out of that system. You don't know how to love. You don't know how to have a caring relationship, a healthy relationship with your spouse. You don't even know how to fit into the community. And so we're feeling the intergenerational effects of that. And so that's why when we start saying to end violence, it's yes, we need more daycare centers, we need more women's safe shelters, but we also need men's wellness and healing centers, and getting our First Nations to come back to their ceremonies so that men do really know their role in a healthy way, that they have a healthy relationship with their spouses and their families. They get that role that they're supposed to be protectors, you know, of the women and not the abusers of us. So all that has to come back to that. So get back to the information again. It's more important to verify it, get it out to the policy and decision makers, and how do we use it in a very proactive way to end the violence.
I appreciate your point, Chief Bellegarde. I note, though, your office has, well, let's just look at a partial list of the issues that you're dealing with. The federal budget that we just talked about earlier. There are fisheries disputes. You just mentioned residential schools, another tragedy that going back generation after generation. Land claims that you want to get resolved. Healthcare services that are unequal across the country. How much of this very ambitious agenda do you really feel you can take on during your time in the position you've just won?
Well, my mandate's till July of 2018. We have a federal election coming up here on October 19th. So I'm meeting with the, we've confirmed dates with the NDP caucus, confirmed dates with the Liberal caucus. I'm trying to confirm dates with the Conservative caucus as well, to make sure that our issues get onto their party platforms, so that our issues become their priority platforms, as you know, platforms within the priorities within their party platform planks. That's the way I want to say it. Because our issues are really all of Canada's issues. Because if we succeed on any of those things you just mentioned, the gap that we talk about closes. And that big gap, 6 versus 63rd, the socioeconomic gap that exists, it is not good for anybody. It's not good for our people. It's not good for Canadians. And I reach out to Canadian people and governments to say it this way, that if you cannot get your head around respecting treaty rights or implementation of treaty rights or recognition of Aboriginal rights and title, if you can't get your heads around that, just get your heads around the business case, because there's a high cost to that poverty that exists. There's a high cost to that gap that exists. And so by reaching out and trying to work with all the parties, because of the federal election coming up, we're trying to influence that as parties, if they become into power, that they have a strong policy platform as it relates to closing that gap. You know, to make investments now in housing and potable water and education and healthcare to address that 6 versus 63rd gap. And once that happens, when we win as First Nations people, everybody wins. So that's what I'm trying to address in this upcoming federal election. It's a daunting task, no question. But I believe if I'm not going to sit on the side and wait. We're trying to be proactive because we're lobbying and trying to educate people about the importance and relevancy of these issues. So it's challenging work, but I'm having fun with it.
Well, in our last minute and change here, let me read one more excerpt to you. This is from a speech, Canada 2020 keynote address that you recently gave. It says, as a national leader, I see a path to hope and well-being for First Nations children and youth, and I see a path to positive change in relations with Canada. The positive change we are driving towards is closing the gap between First Nations and the rest of Canada on all the important indices of social and economic development. To win that change, First Nations are daily asserting our fundamental rights as peoples in our territories. What signs are you seeing, if any, that there is the potential for some constructive engagement with Canada on the issues you care about?
Well, you have 633 First Nations across Canada. You have 58 different nations. So the importance of promoting, preserving, enhancing Indigenous language is another priority. That helps, we're trying to as well work with the provinces to change curriculums in 3 areas. And we see that starting to happen. Treaties have to be taught in every school system across Canada. On and off reserve. Treaties and Aboriginal rights have to be taught. We see that being done in Saskatchewan, and in Manitoba is going to start looking at that. The impacts of the residential schools have to be taught in the provincial school systems. That's starting to be looked at and addressed. And the importance of recognition of Indigenous languages, you know, and challenging the myth in a respectful way that Canada was founded on 2 founding nations, just English and French, when there's 58 different Indigenous nations here that had a big hand in helping settle Turtle Island. Those 3 changes are happening. We're starting to look on the economic front about people starting to talk about revenue sharing and getting our First Nations people involved in the economy. Tables have been set up in different provinces regarding duty to consult and accommodate, you know, which means that the provinces and the industries are starting to recognize that and trying to find ways to reach out to partner with First Nations peoples. That's a positive thing. I look at the strong economic development track records of Chief Clarence Louis at Osoyoos, doing great things in economic wise. Chief Darcy Bear at Dakota Whitecap, Chief Robert Louis at Westbank, Chief Terry Paul at Membertou. There are success stories. And more people now are starting to come back to their identity as Indigenous peoples, getting more pride in their languages, in their customs, in their traditions. Because our old people, I say it this way, we walk in both worlds. We need an education, K-12, university, technical, vocational on one hand. Equally important is who we are and where we come from, our languages and our ceremonies, and we need both. And I see that starting to happen. And so that's why I say there's hope, and we have to keep doing things that bring about hope for our children, that the status quo is not acceptable, and we can't do this alone. So which is why I will always reach out to Canadians and to governments and industry to work with us to help close that gap, and that's going to provide hope and change for the future. That we want to celebrate Canada's birthday in a good way in 2017.
Chief Bellegarde, we wish you well with your work, and we thank you for coming on TVO tonight to discuss it with us. Thanks so much.
Thanks for the opportunity.
Help TVO create a better world through the power of learning. Visit supporttvo.org and make a tax-deductible donation today.